Welcome everyone, thanks for joining. My name's Ollie Pinson-Roxburgh, co-founder at Bulletproof, and in today's webinar, The Race to Remote Security, we're going to be answering your questions around remote working and securing your remote workforce. Just before we get started, a few housekeeping items. We're going to be answering your questions that you submitted during the registration, and so if you have any particular questions that you didn't get answered today, feel free to reach out to us directly. You'll get the recording within 24 hours, and we're going to be sending you a survey out towards the end, so it'd be great if you could give us some feedback to let us know what we're doing well. If there's any other topics or anything you want us to cover, we'd be more than happy to try and put something together. So let's get on with it. So to give you a bit of background before we get into the questions, we put this webinar together because a lot of our customers were starting to ask us very similar questions around how do they secure their workforce now they've moved everyone remote. And so we thought we'd take this opportunity. We can answer all those questions for everyone, as well as we can ask if anybody has any additional questions during the registration and get those answers as well. So today's session is going to be largely Q&A with a few slides just to give you some context around things like the threat landscape, as well as some of the things to consider in relation to the remote working situation. So without further ado, let's start with looking at the current landscape. What's changed, if anything, now we're all remote working? Three real areas which I think is going to be some area of concern really, and the first is, are the attackers really going to benefit right now from the disruption? I certainly think they will, and we're already seeing that the attackers are utilizing this disruption either because they're using phishing campaigns that directly relate to remote access, remote working, also of course targeting people's interests in the current situation with COVID-19. So this the standard approach that they would normally take, so not sort of looking at new attacks, more looking to improve their current attacks using things like phishing, using this time where people are distracted in order to benefit from that, as well as to use the current situation to build brand new campaigns to target people and their concerns. There is also the potential that the attackers will see this as an opportunity to attack different systems and different environments. So, for example, maybe targeting your internal infrastructure where you may not have the same level of scrutiny from a security standpoint, or even monitoring of those environments, and also where you might be distracted on performing and setting up remote working activities. The attackers can then focus in on more of the areas where you might be not necessarily monitoring and reviewing those environments. And also the other thing to consider, of course, is that many organizations had to get everyone remote working fairly quickly in short order, and so they didn't really do a great deal of planning around how they might do that, and essentially adopting brand new technologies without really testing and considering those. So there's a couple of things there. We've also seen, of course, apps and mobile apps and also other sort of websites that are coming out that are tools to assist you in understanding what the current situation is regarding COVID-19, and of course many of those end up becoming malicious in their intent as opposed to being useful solutions, and so it has shown that the attackers are using the situation to their advantage. Step one, now that we've all gone to a remote working strategy, in my opinion, is to check the current security standpoint. So where are we currently at? Do we understand if we have any new risks that have been introduced, if we've had to deploy new technologies, and what are those risks? With the existing technology, are we confident in our existing solutions, and did we deploy those in a secure fashion in the very first place? Because of course attackers are now looking to scrutinize those organizations that have moved to remote working strategy, because they know that there will be scenarios where people have just misconfigured systems. Is there more that we can be doing to protect our staff? Maybe the early stage deployment of the solution is MVP, so the bare minimum we could do to get it up and running, but now of course there's an opportunity to continue to improve and harden systems. And is this a long-term solution that we need to consider changing our approach longer term and our policies and procedures and documentation, or is it just a short-term solution while you look to implement a more production-ready, more long-term system? And then, of course, what's the strategy around that? We'll talk a bit more about that when we're answering some of the questions later on around privacy by design, security by design. And do your staff know what they should be wary of whilst they're remote working? Have they been updated on what the potential threats might be, what they need to think about? And of course, do you understand what the risks are with your remote workforce? So we'll talk about that in the coming slides. Many organizations we're speaking to are asking themselves the question, am I more at risk now than I was before? Of course, there will be certainly more risk because, of course, you're introducing a completely different approach and a different strategy. But let's have a look at some of those potential risks in the next few slides. Am I more at risk now is a really hard question to answer, especially as every situation is unique. I've spoken to several businesses already who have always had a large population of their staff remote working, and their security and processes have been well tested and well thought through. It's almost BAU, but for many of us, that's not the case. It's a brand new challenge to address, having asked your remote workers to or your workers to work remotely. And the problem really is that you're only as strong as your weakest link, and with your remote workforce they are more likely now to be your weakest link, because you can't really control their internet traffic anymore, which you'd have a much greater control over in the office. You could obviously restrict where they go to, you can use proxies to look for malicious sites and all those good things. Now they're using their home internet. You don't know how well they've secured that. You don't know if their Wi-Fi is set up securely. They don't know if there's any sort of restrictions on where they can go. It's most likely not. So there's a few concerns there. Also, if you've issued hardware to your end users and your workforce, then in theory you could have hardened them and restricted a lot of access on those laptops already. So obviously that's the ideal scenario. If you hadn't done that once you push those laptops out because it was done in a short period of time, then it's something you can do retrospectively and you should consider doing anyway. If you've got users who are going down the route of using BYOD, then you really need to audit their devices to identify, are they patched to the latest versions? Do they have AV on it? Is there any other security controls they have in place? You obviously can't necessarily enforce that they have the right software installed or the same level of software that you use commercially, but you could certainly enforce a best practice on them. If you're really worried about using BYOD, then you could look at something like a cloud solution where you provide them with a workstation in the cloud, and then you can control where they have access to systems, and also then they won't be saving data necessarily to their local laptop. They're more likely to save it in the cloud on the cloud workstation, which then means of course you have greater control over that, and you don't have to worry quite so much about those desktops. Of course they are still a risk because of course they have access to systems that then subsequently then go on to having access to your customer data, but it's reducing the risk as much as you can. Now, of course, as I say, home internet is nowhere near as secure as an office networks, so there's a huge amount of risk there. And also you aren't going to be able to necessarily monitor those devices as you would typically do to see where they're talking to and what they're accessing on the internet in order to spot the early signs of attack. So you just need to be a bit more conscious of that fact and find new and interesting ways to monitor those workstations. So let's get straight into the questions. The first sort of area we're going to be talking about is secure remote access best practices, what you can do to protect yourself with regards to remote access. So our first question is, our users only need access to cloud services? Is there anything else we should consider to protect us? So yeah, of course, the benefits of going to a service which is hosted in the cloud is that you can access it from all around the world, wherever you may be, generally through a web browser. And of course, from any sort of access, whether it's from your local internet connection or a coffee shop or anywhere. The downside, of course, is that the attackers realize that, and so they do actually target the cloud services themselves, and I'll talk a bit about that later. But if you want to sort of restrict access further, some of the best ways to do that is one, to look at using VPNs. So you can VPN into your office network, which then gives you a static IP address or an IP address that you can use to access other systems that you know will always be the same, which means that you can add restrictions into your cloud services to say, I only allow access, should I say, from this IP address, which means that the chances of an attacker being able to brute force or gain access to your systems are very low. The other option is that with many of the cloud services, you can turn on things like conditional logging, which basically means that if you know where your user is going to be accessing the system from, you can restrict access to only those sources of access. So, for example, you could say, for example, all of my users are in the UK, and so I'm only going to allow access from the geolocation, which is the UK or Europe or something along those lines. Or equally, if you have users that do on occasion work from other locations, then you can certainly allow for that as well. But obviously in the current climate, as you know that people will be sitting fairly static, you can define where they're going to likely come from and restrict access just to those locations. This question, I think, relates to remote workers' machines. So what should we use to protect their local machines? Now, of course, from a best practice point of view, we should really focus on the basics. So get your systems patched. So make sure that they have a process for patching their machines. Either if you've issued those laptops, you can ensure that they are tied into a system that makes sure they're regularly updated. Either you push those updates or they're automatic. If they are using BYOD devices, again, that should be one of those critical items you ensure that they have got turned on as automatic updates on their systems. But also, of course, making sure they're installing AV, so antivirus, and they have that updated on a regular basis. And also just to validate what type of antivirus solution are they using. Does it meet the criteria of your business? Is it acceptable? And you need to make sure, of course, they're trained to ensure that they understand how to use those systems and keep them up to date. The other part to this as well to consider is there an additional layer of security you might require? So, for example, if they're sharing their internet connection with others in their environment, so whether they're flat sharing or if they are in a scenario where they have others using the same network to perform tasks, i.e. work from home as well, then you might want to look at making sure that you add an extra layer of security, because if their systems aren't at the same level of security that you're enforcing, you might find those machines get compromised, and if they get compromised, they may be able to jump from that network onto your devices and then, of course, gain access to your systems internally. So it's worthwhile considering, is there other things you can deploy, things like endpoint security solutions that can protect maybe it from your devices from a network point of view, or other solutions that enable you to at least keep an eye on and monitor what's going on in those systems to ensure that they aren't under attack. This question is linked to the previous one. We cannot always issue laptops that are hardened and protected, as we talked about on the previous slide, and are considering BYOD. Is there any tips to how we can do this in a secure way? Well, firstly, of course, just follow best practices as suggested previously, and assess their devices before you allow them onto the network. Define a minimum standard for your BYOD devices. Like I said, things like, are they patched? Are they running AV, for example? Have they been hardened in some way? Unlikely, I'd say, with BYOD devices, but we can always hope. And of course, what you can do with some technologies is to put additional layers of restriction in if it's not a corporate issued laptop. It's a good approach if you can manage to do that. And so you kind of limit based on what they've got installed in their systems, i.e. if they're not running to the same standard as your standard issue systems, then you could restrict access to certain systems, documents, locations, that kind of stuff. If possible, put in place some sort of restrictive controls around those BYOD devices, but certainly monitor where they're going to, what they're accessing. So adding sort of additional layers of monitoring, maybe be a bit more diligent around those sorts of devices and what they're accessing and when, because if you spot any sort of sign of them doing something that's abnormal or different to their typical jobs, then you can, of course, shut down the access to those systems and review what's going on and talk to the individual themselves. In the next section, we're going to cover off secure remote IT support. Obviously, it's a bit of a challenge to administer devices remotely. So often IT teams will use remote administration software to sort of facilitate that, and it opens you up to a fairly significant risk and certainly a big threat, and it could have a huge impact on the business if somebody was to gain access as an IT or the same level as an IT support person would. So we're going to cover off a couple of questions in this section around that specifically. Is there anything we can do to make administrator access more secure? We use VPN and 2FA. So that's a great start. Of course, if you can make sure your admins are using a VPN with two-factor authentication so that when they access their systems, they're doing it in a secure way. Of course, the big risk is that your admins have fairly high levels of permissions in your environment typically, and there's a risk that if their account gets compromised, then it's game over. So again, follow best practices. Make sure that the admins are using dedicated admin accounts and not default, because if somebody does compromise the account and manage to get through the 2FA in some way, you have no idea whose account's been compromised if you're sharing an account. So move away from that model if you've got that model already. Make sure you're regularly testing those systems. So of course there's always new vulnerabilities coming out for VPN, and certainly at this point in time attackers will be really looking at technologies that provide assistance with remote working, things like Zoom, things like of course the VPN technologies, as well as things like Microsoft Teams and sort of Microsoft Office 365 accounts. Even the TFA integration will be of interest to attackers to circumvent. If you can enforce IP restrictions where possible using the VPN, then you should certainly do that. And also segmenting the network so that when you come in through the VPN, making sure that you don't have unvetted access to everything once you're in through the VPN, still having things like jump hosts and jump box and systems you can go on to next, rather than just getting full access to the network. Because if somebody again does get access to a compromised VPN account, they can't just suddenly go around your whole network and also even maybe target your remote workers. The cloud at the bottom, that just shows you what we see in our honeypot system. So when they're getting hit up and the attackers are trying to brute force the systems, these are the top sorts of credentials that they're using to log in. And so as you can imagine, if you have a system where they're using the defaults, you're going to get hacked pretty quickly. So as per the previous question, obviously was more about maybe the IT team remote supporting your internal systems. The next question is more relating to your remote workforce. What is the best approach to supporting users when they are remote? Are there any security concerns? The two key concerns from my point of view on this one is the remote administration software, or the remote software you're using to support your teams configured in a secure way, i.e. you're not doing things like sharing passwords between administrators, so you can almost remote administer any system anywhere in the world that you might want to using the same password, because of course if somebody finds out what that password is, they might be able to gain access to those systems to remote administer them. And also on a similar vein, you might find that attackers will start targeting your users with IT support ticket requests into them to say, hey, can I just quickly remote administer your machine? I'm going to send you a link. Can you let me in? And then they of course compromise those machines. So just be conscious of that as a potential threat with regards to remote working. And the second thing is more about making sure that you have checked the software that you're running and it's not vulnerable to attack. So it doesn't have any sort of potential vulnerabilities that the attacker might be able to use to exploit those systems. The next area of concern is those organizations who've migrated to a cloud-based platform, a platform like Office 365 and G Suite. So the next section, we're just going to talk a bit about some of the specific threats around cloud systems and what you need to be thinking about. A quick overview of the potential risks before we get into the questions. The sort of impact of an O365 or a cloud service account compromise can really vary in severity depending on the actor's objectives and intentions. Once an actor has obtained credentials in many of these cloud accounts, they almost always get unvetted access to everything that you then have available in that account, as you would do as if you were a standard user. So in the case of Office 365, it could be things like SharePoint, where you store sensitive information, or OneNote, or maybe Word or Excel. But also on some of the other services, you might get access to cloud storage accounts, Gmail. So all of these sorts of systems, of course, provide the attacker with additional leverage as a kind of launch pad to carry out any further compromises within the organization, such as things like impersonating that user in order for monetary gain. So maybe emailing the CFO and saying, hey, can you pay this bill into this account for me because it's an emergency transaction we need to make. Maybe stealing sensitive commercial information that can be sold on, or using the compromised account to perform things like spear phishing attacks to maybe steal additional information or credentials from other users or even users within your supply chain. And also there is a potential for them to be able to set up things like forwarding rules within those services in order to covertly forward emails onto their own email addresses and of course then use that to steal any potential information. So with that in mind, the first question really talks about hybrid deployment. So for those who are not familiar with hybrid deployments, a hybrid deployment is where you are still running your traditional on-premises type Active Directory or authentication services and services internally, and you've also then gone on to look to migrate into the cloud services like Office 365, and you're in between two worlds. So you kind of have some systems on site which you're hosting yourselves or through a private cloud service, and you've also got Office 365, and while you transition, you're running those two environments in parallel. So this question is, what do we need to consider if we are in a hybrid deployment? So from a security standpoint, the platform's sort of native security controls typically don't allow for you to have both cloud and on-premise data in a central place, which basically results in duplicate processes. You have to monitor two environments for potential attacks and threats to your system. So you might get alerts to say, hey, somebody's trying to attack your on-premises environment, and you might not see that in the cloud environment, and vice versa, and or you might be getting attacked in both environments, but you've got to go to two places to figure out that you're being attacked. So one, it's that kind of duplication of effort and adding additional headaches onto your IT team and also your security pros. The other question typically comes down to how well have you hardened your on-premises environment, and have you done the same thing going to Office 365? As we've already mentioned, it's a shared responsibility model, so you have to make sure you secure both, and you're doing it in the secure way, so make sure you're testing both environments. Second thing as well is one of the biggest challenges often becomes synchronizing accounts, and how do you do that in a secure way? Now, the NCAC's guidelines around this saying that you should synchronize with the Azure AD services. It's a pretty scary thing to consider synchronizing any of your credentials with a cloud service, but certainly seems like the more secure approach is to sync with the cloud Azure AD service as your primary authentication source, and that will lower the risks compared to you running your own ADFS system. This question is more relating to, I guess, licensing. So what's the benefits of going to Office 365 Enterprise over the standard licensing? The key thing here with Office 365 and with a lot of the other providers is the basic tools you're provided are good, but they often don't include all the extra bells and whistles you might need. So for example, in Office 365, when you start going to the enterprise model, you get things like ATP, which is a sort of threat protection suite of tools that you get. They also tend to include in those higher tiers things like phishing tests that you can run. It also allows you to run brute force attacks against your accounts. It also escalates and alerts on a lot of stuff that you wouldn't get as part of your standard license. So there are a lot of benefits from moving to the enterprise suite because you do get extra alerting and all these extra cool things. Alerts like impossible travel. So somehow somebody's account is logging in from the US when they're actually only been based in the UK that same day, or logged in from the UK the same day, and you can track those things to see if somebody's trying to sort of either brute force your account or successfully manage to log in as a user from a different location around the world. So some of the features in the ATP solutions that come into things like Office 365 are really powerful and very useful, and certainly something to consider for those organizations. The key thing with all of this is, however, that you should be monitoring it. And if you're not monitoring those alerts in Office 365, then it's not really benefiting you a great deal. So making sure, yep, you look to the extra features within Enterprise, but then also make sure you're monitoring at the same time. I've touched on this question already. What are the risks on the machines the users connect in with when using G Suite or other cloud services? The key thing here, of course, is that the local machine, if it is vulnerable to attack, and the users have been downloading documents from your cloud services onto the local machine, you're still going to lose that data. So the key thing is to make sure that they've got some security controls on the local system and that they're not downloading content. They may be working with content online in the cloud services as opposed to using it on their local machines if they can do that, especially, of course, as we've said, if it's a BYOD device, because you can't control who may have access to that system and might get access to sensitive information. Okay, this is an interesting question. Should I pen test Office 365? Well, this is, I guess, in general around cloud services. Should you be able to pen test those environments? Often the providers of these services are already penetration testing their systems. They're obviously aligned to security best practices, and they often have high levels of compliance that they've obviously jumped through many hoops for many organizations, and so their compliance is of a high standard and security of course of a high standard. But of course you also do want to validate that they're doing the right things. In many cases you don't have the option to. The third party provider doesn't allow you to penetration test their systems. If you can get them to, then great. The options are really relating to Office 365 is that you can audit your configuration, and as I've mentioned already, because of this shared responsibility model, you should do some form of health check to ensure that you've configured it in the right way and you're using all of the features available to you to secure your customers and your employees. So ideally you should perform some form of health check where you can't do a pen test. That last slide nicely introduces this slide really, which is that we can perform Office 365 health checks for you. The way we do it is essentially to cover 91 best practice guidelines around Office 365, and we look to check areas like authentication and accounts, as well as data management, email security, exchange online, as well as auditing, storage, and then also mobile device management. Essentially what we're doing is checking for those best practices, things like, are you doing logging? Do you have two-factor authentication in place? Have you implemented all of the relevant security controls? And making sure that you've considered all of the areas where you could potentially harden your systems. You can't often you can't implement everything, but it's just a good way to ensure that you can where you can harden systems, you have implemented it. If you want more information, contact us at info@bulletproof.co.uk. With many organizations worried about their current setup, we have had a fair few questions around how do I make sure that my system stands up to attack. So doing things like remote penetration testing, as well as looking at patch management. So in this next section, we'll just answer some of those questions around that area. One of the questions we've been asked recently is what are the limitations of testing when you don't have a workforce in the office? So what this is really getting at is that many organizations, when they do an internal penetration test, they have the penetration tester sit inside of the organization with all the workers around it. And of course, the risks are that if the systems that the workers are using are vulnerable, the attacker might be able to, or the penetration tester might be able to exploit those systems to gain access to other resources inside of the environment. Now, of course, as people have gone to remote working, is there still that same level of testing? Now, if your remote workforce are connecting in over a VPN into systems internally based, it's still relevant to, of course, do the testing internally. Or what you can do, of course, is position the tester as if they are a remote worker and to see if they can gain access to the systems that your teams are using in the remote workforce, or target other remote workers that are on the same network. So there's definitely value and benefit in continuing to do your internal penetration testing, even if those remote workers are not going to be inside of the office locations. You, of course, should always test the internal locations as well, and again, that can be done remotely, typically anyway. So sort of testing inside your networks, testing your internal servers if you have any, and then of course the other thing is if you have put restrictions around accessing cloud services, it's a good opportunity to test whether those services are in place, and also of course testing your VPN to see if it's vulnerable to attack. So this next question is, we are worried about how to effectively test patches prior to applying them. Is there a general best practice to limit outage? Yeah, I can imagine this is probably a concern for many organizations. As your remote workforce needs their systems patched, how would you go about patching them if you are remote? And your typical process might be to take a laptop, apply the latest patches, see if it affects any of the systems, and then of course then deploy it out to all your systems, and maybe and your other remote workers. But maybe your IT team now is of course not and doesn't have access to all of the devices they might need to test all those systems. So good practice says that you should be testing those patches because you might break a load of things that affect your workforce. So my general rule of thumb here would be, if your IT team can test it on their local machines first so that it doesn't affect remote workers, then great. Otherwise, the advice would be to spread the patching out to only apply it to systems where you might want to pick 1 or 2 people in each team, so you don't end up affecting a whole team if the patch doesn't work. You can also test it so that you can test your core applications again, maybe on a cloud workstation prior to deploying it to other systems, just to make sure it doesn't have any adverse effects. Okay, our last section here is maintaining compliance standards, and how does that affect us now that we're all remote working? So the first question is, does anything change regarding GDPR? Well, no, unfortunately not. GDPR still applies, and your employees need to follow policies, their standard policies and procedures that you've set in place regarding GDPR. It should be noted, however, that the ICO has said that they will consider that the data subject to access requests may take slightly longer as you're remote working and your staff might be not necessarily fully available. But the key thing in relation to GDPR is that you make sure that your staff are reminded of their data protection duties and responsibilities when they're remote working. You might also want to get them to do a short refresher training session. It can be easy for the staff to sort of become more relaxed while they're remote working around their responsibilities. How would you deal with documents being printed whilst remote working? I mean, obviously we want to keep that to a minimum, particularly anything with personal data or sensitive information data. Consider if the data destruction policy has anything regarding what you might want to do if you're working from home, or maybe adjust that to support it. Of course, you shouldn't be putting anything in your bins, and of course, if you do have to print that information off, if you can shred it and you can follow the normal processes then at home, then that would be great. But of course, it would also be advised that you keep the shredded paper for secure destruction if possible. If you can't, it might be sensible to ask your team to maybe secure those documents in a locked cupboard, and they can bring them into the office when they are able to return. The next question, how do I maintain ISO 27001 whilst remote working? This is a little bit more difficult than some of our other questions. You may have to put in some temporary changes to your processes to accommodate the kind of change to remote working. The key thing is to ensure you've reviewed your policy and procedures and you've come up with the temporary arrangements so that it doesn't increase any risk to the business. So you might need to think about what the changes might mean for the risks to the business, and ensure that you have put something in place to mitigate those risks and to reduce them as much as possible, or get sign off from the business and make sure the business accepts that risk. The next question is, how do I assess the risks of remote working? Well, a lot of what we've already talked about are of course the key areas of risk, but you'll need to be looking at areas that are different from an employee's normal office-based working environment and systems they're working with. Are an employees accessing different information that they didn't in the office? And if so, has anything sort of changed to make sure they're trained on it and your policy and procedures cover it? How are you providing the technical support of your home workers? How are they storing data? And of course, if it's paper-based data, how are they storing that information specifically? How are your teams sharing information? Are they doing it over a secure means that you have put in place and have control of? Or are they finding other ways to communicate with their team that may not meet the stringent security controls that you have in place for the rest of the business? And if they are storing any data on their mobile phones, is it a company-owned system or is it their own? And if it's their own, what sorts of controls do you have in place for that? Okay, well that's it. That's all the questions we had. That just leaves me to sort of wrap things up really in this sort of next section. So there are a few key topics here in summary. First is to make sure you have secured your cloud platform. So if you've moved over to the cloud to support your remote working, just consider what you've done so far. Have you done anything to audit it? And have you tried to harden those systems, or is it just a vanilla deployment? Vanilla deployment, standard deployments on these systems generally is of a fairly high standard, but always needs additional tuning in order to get it really down to the right level of security and best practice. You need to audit your workforce, of course, really understand how they're using systems, what are they doing day to day, how are they working with your data and your systems, and also make sure you're monitoring that on the server side and the cloud side as well. So having a team monitoring daily to make sure that you know what's going on with the remote workforce. One of the things that has been brought up, of course, is about auditing Teams and monitoring Teams access within Office 365. That's certainly something you can do and enforce, and just make sure your team is keeping an eye on that. There's quite a bit of security controls around that, so it's always worthwhile looking to implementing that, as well as just general monitoring on your cloud services and cloud accounts. Update and train your staff on secure working. Just make sure they know what they need to be thinking about day to day, and ensure that they're conscious of any potential new threats that they might be facing as they are remote workers. And don't be afraid to test your systems as you would do normally in this scenario. It's as good a time as any really to test out both your staff and also your systems you're using. And further to that, I just thought I'd add a couple of links here that are worthwhile looking at. You can either Google for them or go to the websites directly. You should be able to find each of these. They're really useful resources that sort of answer a lot of the questions we've also provided today, but also should give you a bit more detail if you want to get into more of the specifics on how to apply some of these security controls. Once again, thanks everyone for joining. We appreciate all the questions that came through. Again, if you didn't get your question answered, feel free to reach out to us, and also get in touch with us to learn a bit more about the services we can provide around remote security and securing your workforce. Obviously around sort of things like training, O365 hardening, remote penetration testing, general sort of monitoring of your systems. We provide a lot of different services around that. If you want to get in contact, email us at info@bulletproof.co.uk. Call us on 01438 532 900, and of course the website is www.bulletproof.co.uk. We are going to be sending out a feedback form. Please let us know what you thought about the session. If you feel like we provided enough information, needed more detail, or if you wanted to talk about other topics you'd be interested in us covering, we'd love to hear your feedback on that. Okay, well that's it. That's all the questions we had. That just leaves me to sort of wrap things up really in this sort of next section.